And I don't think we talked about this, Amy, but we're actually already recording it.
Okay.
And then, we still have to get it, run it through our compliance team, make sure neither one of us go off the rails. And assuming it's okay, then we'll post it to our social media platforms and websites so people can watch. We did have several people say they wanted to watch it after the fact.
Right. That works. And we've done that a lot with our trade associations this year. As the conferences in person have gone away, we've just pre-recorded webinars and then people can access them, which has been nice.
And I've mixed experience with that. A big conference that I've attended the last 10 years. It was, of course, virtual only this year, and it was okay, not the same.
No,
but
you definitely miss the tips that you learn from other people interacting, like how they're actually running their business or things that are working, not working. Like that's the part I miss.
Yeah. Well, that conference was in Florida, so I missed the weather too.
That's where ours are. Yeah.
Conference capital of the world, at least for the East Coast.
Definitely. We used to meet in DC and then we figured out the weather was better in Florida and the hotels were half the cost and you could tack on a family vacation. And so we just never shifted back.
Yeah. Give it a couple more minutes and we'll dive in.
Okay.
So I've got it at the top of the hour. We'll wait like 1 or 2 more minutes, allow folks to dial in. Since we started at 12 noon, we want to make sure we start right around 12, but give a couple more minutes for people to dial in.
Okay.
And then we'll be off and running. All right, so I have it at one pass. So I say we go ahead and dive in. I'll welcome everybody to the Hickson Associates Wealth Management Quarterly Webinar. Today we're going to be joined by Amy Natt. Well, we're already joined by Amy Natt. Amy, thank you for joining us. We'll get to her presentation in a couple of minutes. That's going to be the meat of why we're gathered here today. But one of the things that we always do before we dive into these types of presentations is we want to give a very brief market update. An economic update. And of course, before we do that, we got to make sure everybody knows that and reads the disclosure to know that this is for informational purposes only, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that said, we will dive in and start off by looking at a couple stock market points. This is the S&P 500, and what I'm trying to show on this particular slide is that September was a very tough month. So you can see I've marked the start of the month and the end of the month. We had about almost a 6% correction in the month of September. Remember, the S&P 500 is a broad measure of the US stock market. What most people don't realize is there's actually 505 stocks in the S&P 500. And so it is a very good measure of the broad markets, but it's not the best measure. This is the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ is very tech heavy. And in the NASDAQ, you have about 2,500 stocks. So about 5 times as many stocks in the NASDAQ as you'd have in the S&P 500. It too had a very rough month of September, again, down about 6%. And this is what we refer to as a seasonality chart. This is showing that on average, how the stock S&P 500 does from 1950 through 2021. That maroon bar is the month of September. The negative maroon bar is the average month of September, and you see at the bottom I've got a blue dot. That's how last month was. So last month was worse than average. And then we also want to look at something that we refer to as breadth. Breadth refers to the amount of participation. Okay, so in the S&P 500, for example, how many stocks in the S&P 500 are in a uptrend? The way that we measure that quickly is by looking at how many stocks are above the 200-day moving average. And this chart shows that there's about 70% of the S&P 500 is above its 200-day average, which means about 30% are below the 200-day moving average. So that means 70% of the S&P 500 is in an uptrend and 30% is in a downtrend. And you can see I've drawn April, I think that's 21st on the screen. So what that means is the breadth or the number of stocks that are above that 200-day average, that figure has been going down since April. It's starting to increase, so that is a good sign. That's the S&P 500. This is that same measure in the NASDAQ. Remember, the NASDAQ has 5 times as many stocks as the S&P 500. And you can see this participation is far weaker. You can see the high point is January 25th. And ever since then, the number of stocks in the NASDAQ that's considered in an uptrend has been going down. Right now, you've got about 33% of the NASDAQ stocks are in an uptrend, which means 67% of those stocks are in a negative trend. So when we see the overall market, we see the index, that doesn't necessarily mean everything is up. The way that most of the indexes, the S&P and the NASDAQ in particular, the way that they're calculated is they're cap weighted. So the heaviest stocks or the largest stocks, think of the trillion-dollar companies, the Facebooks, the Netflix, the Amazons, the Apples, those are the biggest stocks as measured by the size of the company. They have an overweight on how the overall index performs. So you could theoretically have 100 stocks in the S&P 500 going up and 400 stocks in the S&P 500 going down. So even though 4/5 of the stocks are going down in that example, the overall index can indeed be going up. So that's why we look at breadth. Breadth is very weak, and it's not a good sign of the overall market's health. Again, the good news is it is starting to get better. And so question, has we turned the corner? This again is our seasonality chart. So this is again on average 1950 through 2021. October, November, December is the best quarter of the year historically, and that blue dot again represents that so far October has started off to be better than average. So that is certainly good news. A couple more slides and we'll kick it off to Amy. One of the things that we've been talking about all year long is inflation. The Federal Reserve has been using words like transitory, which is a fancy way of saying they believe inflation is going to be a temporary problem. We've been disagreeing all year, and the data suggests that this might not be temporary at all. Good news is Social Security recipients are going to get a 5.9% bump in their benefits next year. That causes other problems, but the bottom line is inflation is definitely a problem. And this measure that we're looking at right here does not count food and energy. But Amy, I don't know about your family. My family uses food and energy all the time. So
Every
why
day.
the heck we consistently report on a CPI figure that doesn't count food and energy is beyond my understanding, but we won't go there. Two more slides. This is something I've been showing consistently for a while because most people remember the stock market is it's continuously up. That's obviously not true. Most of our clients have lived through at least one bad bear market. This is a 15-year time period in the broad U.S. stock market, again, the S&P 500, where I'm showing that, again, over a 15-year time period, the market kind of just moved sideways, but it did it very, very violently. So this is not hypothetical. And this is also I'm not trying to be prophetic. I'm not trying to say that this is going to happen again, but this is something I'm trying to use as a reminder to people that the stock market does not always move up. And typically we think of a 10-year time horizon as a long time horizon, but this is a 15-year time horizon that we have on the screen, and it was a very difficult time horizon. One of the reasons why it was so difficult is because, again, inflation. So again, on the bottom part of this chart is I've got the inflation data, and it's not a one-to-one correlation. On the right-hand side, you can see rise in inflation, but you still had a rising stock market. But you can also see a couple of other spots on that chart where we've got rise in inflation and a very declining stock market. So inflation is our number one fear, number one concern right now. We don't think it's going away, but we also don't want to spend too much time talking about that because that's not why y'all have joined us today. You've joined us to listen to Amy. Amy is somebody we have known for several years. Her office is in Southern Pines, technically walking distance from our office down there. And Amy, why don't you start us off by telling us just a little bit about how you started AOS, and of course, what is AOS, and then we'll dive in to hear you talk a little bit more about how we can be helping our parents and protecting our parents. I know that we connected earlier this year on a particular case, so we'll probably end up talking about that too, but tell us a little bit about AOS.
Okay, thank you, Ted, so much for having me. One of my favorite topics to talk about is the work that we do with older adults and their families. So AOS is a company that I actually founded in 1999. That was following, I was in graduate school at Oklahoma State University and happened to discover that you could get a master's degree in gerontology, which most people in their early 20s probably wouldn't gravitate toward the study of aging, but I had a very close relationship with my grandparents and great-grandparents growing up, and assisted through the process of a nursing home placement, dealt with a great-grandparent with dementia. So it was a field that I was always really drawn to. So once I finished school and relocated to the East Coast, which was the best decision ever, I founded Aging Outreach Services.
So are you from Oklahoma?
So I was actually from Illinois, but I spent from second grade through post-grad in Oklahoma. So definitely Midwestern.
Not a state I visited yet.
Yeah,
it's on the list.
Pretty flat. There's not a lot there. So one of the things that I found interesting, and this actually goes back to my grad school days, is there was demographic data that sort of showed with the population born, and as that population got older, what statistics would look like in the year 2020, 2030, 2040. So to me, really, not only was that job security, but it meant that there was really going to be a need to take care of this population that was growing. So if you look at the numbers, the 65 and up population increased from 35 million in 2000 to 41.4 million in 2011. And then if you project out that data, it's projected to more than double to 92 million people over the age of 65 in the year 2060. So if we back that up a little to 2040, we'll have about 79.7 million older people which is twice the number we had in 2000. There's a few different reasons for this data. And the one thing that sticks out to me is I remember when I was looking at these population pyramids is that it was almost our pyramid went from a very small tip triangle and it basically inverted so that we have this baby boom population sort of coming up and aging, and it was almost that our population would flip. We'd have more older adults and we would have younger people. The other thing that's really played into that, and probably most of the people on this call, is that it's not just that baby boom generation right now, because that's a pretty healthy, active generation, it's their parents. And so what's happened is the 85 plus segment of our population is really the fastest growing. That's where we're seeing the most, the numbers grow. It's tripled from 55.7 million in 2011 to 14.1 million in 2040. And there's a few reasons for that. You can look at our society and probably look at your own parents and grandparents and figure out that people are living longer. There's been a lot of advances in medical technology that's available. There's been lifestyle changes, education. And so in general, we're seeing that, people are living way beyond 85. I'm sure you as well as I could give plenty of examples of clients that are well and, making it to the age of 100. So while that used to be pretty rare, it's really something that we're seeing more and more. And so people are having to not only plan financial resources like you all help with to live way beyond the age of 85, but it also means that most adult children will be dealing with taking care of parents. And most of us don't all live in the same area anymore. We talked about, my move, that's not uncommon. Most adult children grow up and sort of take off in different parts of the country. And so you may or may not live in the same area as your parents do, and that can pose some other challenges. And so we'll touch on that a little bit today as well.
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely curious to chat a little bit more about. That's what one of the things that we're experiencing is the risks and clients having parents scattered across the country, and how do I help them, and how do I?
Right. Do I relocate them? Do I not? Like, there's a lot of factors that go into that and that thought process. And that's the type of thing that we help people navigate a lot. Care management is a term that maybe isn't as familiar, but if you think of a care manager as somebody whose education is in gerontology or sometimes social work, but we work directly for the family. So we're helping families navigate these issues that come up as people are facing the challenges of aging. And so it's really rewarding from my aspect to be able to work directly with these families to help them age the way they want to, and to help kind of make sure that care is really individualized to what that person's goals are. So that's a lot of what we do on the day-to-day.
Okay.
So for the purposes of today, when we were talking about this webinar, we discussed a few different questions that we wanted to hit on. So these are the things where we'll focus, but at the end, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, and then I'll make sure that there's a way that you all can follow up afterwards as well, so if you have questions. So the 4 areas that we'll touch on: how do I protect my parents from potential scams? What is the most effective approach to communicating with aging parents? And then what are some indicators that may show you that your parents need more support, whether it's something where you're checking in over the phone or you visit. Our busiest time of year is after adult children have come at Thanksgiving and Christmas. And
wow.
they walked into mom and dad's home and they're like, there's some mail stacked up, there's things growing in the fridge. Like, there's these little signs that once you start looking can really tell you that it's probably time for some more support. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with, what having, dealt with family members maybe through the aging process and seeing some of those challenges, is what can you do now while you're independent and good health and really preparing for the future. My favorite clients are the ones that I get that are very independent and just really looking ahead to, how do I plan to really navigate the next 20 years of my life? What will I need? What support will there be? So now is the right time to start thinking about those things.
Yeah. Excellent.
All right, so and look, and this could be your parents, it could be another family member. What we see a lot is neighbors or professionals like Ted that are dealing with clients, and there's really some red flags when you start, go to it's tax time, or there's certain things with banking that may come up as a red flag. And so it may be your parents, but it may also be just older adults in general that you may interface with in your life. All right, so senior fraud. Nearly 25 million Americans are victims of fraud each year. Adults over 65, and really again over that 85, are the prime target. Studies have shown that 60 to 80% of telemarketers and some of these different fraud schemes that we'll talk about are really targeted toward older adults. So why target older adults? Well, there's a few reasons, but as we talked about, it is the fastest growing segment of our population. So we have this large group of people, and again, think back to that 85 plus that we said is the fastest growing of that 65 plus group. Most likely to have some type of nest egg, right? A lot of people have planned for or saved their entire life, and they get to their older years and they own their home, they own their car. They typically have good credit, and they have this nest egg that they've sort of saved their whole life, and that money's sitting there. They're less likely to report fraud because they're embarrassed, right? A lot of the people that I've experienced that have fallen victim to some of these schemes that are out there are intelligent people. They had successful careers, and honestly, they're embarrassed that they fell for this. And so they're they're not likely to report it, which means then it's very hard to kind of put it on the radar of the people that could do something about it. A lot of times they don't realize they've been scammed, right? And we'll talk about some of these, but whether it's a handyman that overcharged them, or somebody that sold them something that it wasn't really what they got, or a bad business deal, like or reverse mortgages are one of the things we've seen a lot of. There's different things that happen that the older adult may not even realize that they were taken advantage of. And then one that I see is playing a really large factor is people are lonely, right? So this has happened a lot during lockdowns and during COVID. We have had a lot of calls from families who the older adult has been isolated during this time, and they've started answering the phone calls. Doesn't matter who it is, somebody to talk to. They're paying more attention to some of the mail coming that's difficult to tell if it's legitimate or not legitimate, but they've just been more isolated over the past 2 years, on top of sort of what the normal aging process can sometimes do. And so you have a trusting population, and then you add loneliness or isolation to that, and it really sadly makes that age group a prime target.
Yeah, that's one of the areas I want to definitely want to circle back to this when we get back and talk more about that, because of the case that we had earlier this year.
Yeah, definitely. And these are some of I'll touch on a few of these, but these are some of the scams that we've seen. And we actually, through a publication that we do, worked with a couple of the police departments for several years that would sort of alert us to some of this scams that are going on, because sometimes unless you're aware that it's an actual fraudulent thing happening, again, you can't imagine that people sit and scheme up these things as ways to take advantage of older adults. But telemarketing is a big one. Home improvement fraud, again, is something that we've seen grow over the last 2 years. So somebody shows up and tells the 86-year-old that their gutters or their roof looks really bad and they're going to have problems, and let me pay to repair that. Well, that person hasn't been able to crawl up on the roof and look at it. They trust the person at the door, and they end up spending thousands of dollars for something they didn't need. We've seen the same thing on renovations in the house. The older adult has paid for something up front, maybe a bathroom renovation, grab bars, safety bars. The person never comes to do the work. Internet scams, if your parents are on the internet, there's certainly lots of confusion with what's a pop-up ad and what's something real, and it's very easy to click on the wrong thing and suddenly you're in a bad area. Healthcare, health insurance fraud. Again, a lot of times families will have us review the bills that they get, and there's oftentimes that an older adult is billed, probably all ages, but particularly older adults are billed for something, procedures they never had. There's a lot of things that come up, equipment, but there's a lot, sadly, in kind of the healthcare world. Counterfeit prescription drugs, again, this one typically happens over the internet. There used to be a lot with funeral and cemetery fraud. I haven't seen as much of that lately, but people that were sold a plot or something they would prepay for, and it wasn't a legitimate funeral home. It was somebody that cold called them or something that they heard about online. Lots of anti-aging products. I probably fall for that one myself all the time. Reverse mortgages. There are some legitimate cases that I've seen a reverse mortgage be helpful, but there's more cases where I've seen the person really lose, and you may have an opinion on that as a financial advisor, but you know, we've seen some people get into bad situations.
Yeah.
All right, you can flip to the next one. So grandparent scams, these hit the news a lot. Somebody calls an older adult in the middle of the night, wakes them up, pretends to be a grandson or a granddaughter. They're stuck in jail or something bad has happened and they need money wired immediately. I've had a couple of friends of mine that actually fell for this scam, that got a call and said it was a family member or a brother-in-law or somebody that, you know, was in trouble and needed help. And so I think our human reaction is to jump in and help. But that's one that I've seen a lot in the news. And I've had local clients that have gotten those calls. So that's become a really common one, unfortunately. Anything that's a free prize or lottery winning. I have some clients who religiously send in the forms in the mail with the checks or the dollars, and I tell them you don't have to pay to win a prize. But a lot of people, it's their only correspondence, right? So if it's the only mail they're getting, a lot of times they'll interact with that. Timeshares used to be a big one. This isn't as common anymore, but there's still some scams out there with these low cost vacations. All of the you must act now and it's free are obviously an issue. Anything high profit, no risk. I wish those were out there, but unfortunately, most of the time it's not legitimate.
Yeah.
All right, so with all of these things out there for ourselves, for our parents, neighbors, how do you help somebody, especially an older adult who is vulnerable, maybe lonely, maybe has some cognitive impairment? How do you help them avoid the scam? Certainly one of the things is just having a dialogue. If I'm an older adult and I'm maybe not online or reading about these things, I probably don't even know that some of these scams exist. So I always like to talk with clients about, let me tell you what some of the common scams are going on so that you'll be aware if you get this call or this phone call, that this probably isn't legitimate. And the first thing I tell them is, if it sounds too good to be true, run it by me first. Right? If it's a legitimate offer or deal, it's going to be there the next day. So if you're feeling pressured to make a decision, I just say, hey, you know, give me a call first. Let's talk about it. And then you can get back to them. So it's almost like you have to give them an out. Sometimes if an older adult answers the phone, they don't want to be rude to the person that's on the other line. So they're not as likely to just hang up or to question what the person is saying. And so with some of our clients, I'll actually write down like 3 or 4 sentences and leave them on a paper by the phone. And that way that older adult can say, hey, how about you send me something in writing that I can review and I'll get back to you? Or I'd like to talk to my son about this. He's an attorney. Let me talk to him and we'll get back to you. Like, I give them some phrases to politely get off the phone. So that seems to help. Remind them never pay for a prize. Anything that you must act now typically is not going to be legitimate. And again, in casual conversations, you can ask, hey, have you had any calls this week? You know, any interesting phone calls, any new friends, any conversations? And sometimes just by sort of asking some of those general questions, especially if it's a parent who lives long distance, they might share with you, oh yeah, this man's called me 3 times, you know, talking about a vacation to the Caribbean, and I'm thinking it really sounds good. I might want to go. Like, just try to keep, try to integrate that into your conversation. If it's a parent who has some cognitive issues. There may be situations where you're actually serving as a durable power of attorney for that individual, or have access to sort of monitor bank activity, not taking control away from them, but sometimes if you're able to kind of monitor checks that they're writing or transactions from that bank, there could be some red flags if you start to see some things that are out of character. We had a gentleman that, I mean, he had wired, gosh, over $45,000 overseas to this. He was retired military and used to managing very intense situations. And this group from overseas got a hold of him, and somehow he ended up wiring them money over and over again. And what finally tipped the family off was reviewing those bank records and those bank bills. And, you know, to the father, it was a very legitimate thing he was involved in. But there was just enough cognitive deficit that he really wasn't thinking logically or clearly. And so taking a look at those records and being able to see if there's, you know, weird numbers on a phone log that seem like they're international or things you don't recognize, that's a good way to sort of tip off that there's an issue.
Yeah.
All right, you can add, I know people will say that they're not 100% effective, but there certainly are still do not mail and do not call lists. Most of you are probably getting the same telemarketers now on your cell phones that I do, but it still doesn't hurt to, if there is a list that you can put them on for do not mail or do not call, to be able to do that. If you're visiting, offer to help sort mail. I do this weekly for some clients, and it seems like a mundane thing, but I can't tell you how hard it is for, you know, somebody who doesn't get a lot of mail or who just isn't used to having to determine like what's legitimate, what's not. There are some things that come in the mail that look very real. And so a lot of clients now, we just sit and sort through that mail together every week and, you know, sort of make a list of this isn't real, this is real. It's very hard to tell with things that are medical, banking, credit card related. So offering, and you can do that. I have families that do that with their loved one over the phone even. You know, hey mom, what's the stack of mail this week? Let's talk through it. So sort of sorting through those stacks, because most older adults will say to you, oh, I'm gonna get to that later. But no, I want that there, don't mess with it. But if you can probe a little deeper and be like, you know, today's a good day, let's just sit and sort it together and then you can take care of it. You really can find out a lot.
Yeah,
and one of the things that's important, yeah, definitely. And you know, I create these form letters that they can send out, or that if they'll let me send out on their behalf, that request to come off the mailing list. So that's important. And you can do it. We probably do it on our email all the time. You can unsubscribe. But if you're dealing with somebody who's old school, you need to unsubscribe the old school way. And actually send a letter to their corporate office or whatever address it gives to get removed from that mailing list. So that's helpful. And then again, if you're dealing with somebody who has fallen victim to something or really believes that legitimately they're dealing with somebody who cares about them, sadly, one of the scams that's really hit the older female population is younger males who are pretending to be a boyfriend and interested in them from other areas. And I've had twice now where I've had ladies in their 70s, late 70s, mailing checks to young males in other countries that wanted to relocate here to be with them. And they can be really convincing on the phone. And so it's important not to shame or blame your parent if they've been involved in this, because they probably will just keep it secret the next time. So it's better just to try to be a good listener and figure out a solution. Even if you're having to really, you know, they really believe it's real, that can be the most challenging. And then monitoring credit reports. Sometimes it can be very enlightening if you can pull the credit report or get your parent to pull the credit report just to see if there's any suspicious activity on there.
Do you recommend freezing credit?
So I've had some people do that. If it's an older adult and say that they're more advanced with dementia, or they have been placed, or maybe they're more, you know, they're not out and active as much. They're not likely to go buy a new vehicle or go on a big vacation. Then I have had adult children freeze that credit because there's not anything in the foreseeable future that they would need it for. And it just keeps, somebody from being able to steal their ID. So, definitely if somebody's sort of past that point where they're going to be utilizing that credit, it can be helpful to go ahead and just freeze it.
I guess this is also part of the having an involvement with the parents, because if, every once in a while you see somebody that's got a ton of money in their checking account, well, why don't we at least move some of that over into the money market or into a different account so it's not all right there, and we can monitor that like you've been suggesting. But it's not, if you see $10,000 coming out of a $30,000 balance, it's better than all of a sudden there's this massive withdrawal in a really large account.
And another, issue we see with the trusting is, so we had a client this week, and we just got involved and we're trying to sort it all out, but we knew there was money in a trust, but yet she had overdrawn $30,000, her electricity was going to be shut off. Like, there were all these issues. And, it turned out this trust was distributing these massive checks to her that she was never cashing, but they're all sitting out on her kitchen table. So anyone that comes in her house to do work, she had a private caregiver she had hired, like, it's just sitting right there. And so, it's really important too, if your parents have people in and out of their house, even if they might be well-intentioned, is you don't want to encourage somebody to cross that line, right? So leaving those bank statements out, or in her case, there was $55,000 worth of checks just sitting there that anybody could have grabbed and deposited. And so, making sure that they're not leaving that information readily accessible to people coming in and out of their house is really important too. And most importantly, be aware, speak out, and report. I listed there's a site, stopseniorscams.org. The FBI has a senior fraud page. Like, sometimes it's good just to take a look. What are the new scams coming out? Be aware of them, and don't be afraid to report it if something does happen, because that's the only way it really stays on the radar for other families and for local police or whatnot to be aware. And one other thing that I'll mention, and I always hate to, but we see it a lot, is one of the most common types of sort of financial abuse that we see is sometimes from family members. And so again, you kind of have to keep it on your radar that if there's a grandchild or whatever, somebody in the family that's really sort of fallen on hard times, and grandma, mom, dad has money, that can make them a common target too. And so just sort of be aware that these things can happen from a variety of sources. We've seen the same, with people who have had help in their home for several years. They get very close to those people. I've seen them give people houses, sign over cars, put them in wills. Like, you just want to be aware of these support people, especially if you live out of the area that your parent is working with. And most are very well intended, but there are several situations people get too comfortable and sort of cross a line. And so it's just very important to be aware of it.
Yeah, well, I'm probably going to circle back to that and ask you a follow-up question on that when we get to the Q&A. I guess I'm also curious, before we move on, is I seem to remember reading a statistic that the number one cause, that's the right word, or source of elder abuse is actually family members.
Yep, and the biggest type is financial. Yeah. So financial abuse or elder abuse is the most common, and it is typically a family member. And we run into it at least every month. We have a case where, there's usually some mental health or substance abuse or something involved, and it starts out small, but it grows and grows and grows. And then what happens is, when mom or dad needs the money to take care of themselves, they don't have it. They don't have the money to pay for the care that they need, and they end up in a really bad situation. And so, typically, sadly, can be a family member.
Yeah, we've seen that.
Yeah. So how to communicate with an aging parent, and this can be whether you live locally or you are communicating with them from afar. Depending what your situation was growing up, how your parents parented you can make communication really easy, or it can make communication really difficult. If there were very clear boundaries and lines when you were growing up, it can be difficult as an adult child to sort of cross that line or cross that boundary when you see a parent struggling, when you see cognitive issues, when they need more help. It's a pride issue. And a lot of times we want to be respectful to our parents, but at the same time, if we don't address certain issues, they can really end up in a bad situation. And so knowing how to talk to them, and then knowing kind of what things to look for that indicate they need more help is what we'll focus on. So again, casual conversations before the crisis. Don't wait till somebody's in crisis to start talking about what they would want as they get older, what they would expect, what do they see themselves staying home? Do they see themselves moving? If they had some big medical issues, are they having cognitive changes? The earlier you can start to talk about these things, the easier the conversations are going to be. Waiting till you're in a crisis to find out what mom or dad would want is the worst time. Emotions are running high. You want to have these conversations a little more casually without all the emotion. If it's a difficult thing for you to do, set up a time to talk. Hey, mom, I really have a few things I'm just trying to get my head around. Is there a time that we could set up to talk for 20 minutes just so I can kind of make sure we're on the same page? Try to cut out unnecessary background noise. There's a lot of issues with hearing as people get older, and so having a conversation where there's fewer distractions is helpful. Trying not to dwell in the past. It's very hard for families not to pull in past dynamics, right? Well, you remember that time I was 18 and you told me, or you did this, like let it go. Try to focus just on the future. The more you bring in past issues, the more you're going to get caught in that cycle and really not make any headway. And that can be difficult. Maybe you didn't have the most nurturing parents growing up, and now here you are taking care of them. And so it can be a challenge, but try to focus on the future. Agree to listen respectfully without blame or attack. It's very hard to sit back and just be an active listener sometimes and not interject what you're thinking, but really make an effort to try to do that. You can offer options or suggestions, but not demands like, hey, mom, you're welcome to come here anytime. We'd love to have you closer, but not, well, you are going to move here because I am not traveling there to take care of you. I've got 3 kids, 2 jobs, like whatever the case, you're going to get a whole lot further if you approach it. We could use this in all areas of our life, right? I use this with my kids. Try to offer some options, suggestions. One of the most important things to compliance with older adults is that they feel like they have a say in it. If somebody's telling them what to do, even if the writing's on the wall, like you're not going to get as far. Try not to draw hard lines in the sand. It's hard to do for all of us, but once you take a hard position, it's pretty easy to back away from that. No. And then offer to write things down. You've got to remember that even though mom or dad may be able to pull it together for that 10-minute phone conversation, they may be having more cognitive issues than you realize. And so I always like, hey, I'm gonna write a summary or some bullet points of what we talked about and just leave it with you, or send it to them in a letter. Even concerns you might have. Sometimes it's easier to express yourself in writing, and then the person can go back and read that over and over again. And sometimes that's much more effective than it is trying to have a heated discussion or constantly saying, don't you remember we talked about this? Mom, we talked about this 3 times. That's not going to be a very productive conversation. So writing things down can be super helpful. Yeah. Agree to be open and honest. Sometimes there's some dynamics there and you just have to say that. Kind of ground rules for the conversation. Definitely ask for input. Even if the input's not logical, not realistic. Mom or dad really has no funds to hire private care, and they need a lot of help and they can't get out of the bed, but they want to stay in their home forever. It may not be something that realistically can happen, but it's important for them to feel heard. So give them that chance to give that input. Present them with the information. Again, a lot of times I like to don't overwhelm them. Don't leave them 20 things, but maybe leave 3 things and say, here's those resources for transportation we talked about. I'm going to leave you these 3 numbers. Or, we've talked about how difficult it is for you to cook a meal, but I really want you to be eating healthier. So I'm going to leave you these 2 options on local meal delivery or people that do meal prep so that you'll have that for later. Presenting that to them so that they can go back and use it on their own terms can be very helpful. Definitely try not to take it personal. Again, try to minimize the emotion. The repeat and summarize what you've heard from them can just help say, well, you know, Mom, what I heard you say is it's really important for you to stay in your home and be surrounded by things that are familiar to you. So Mom, even though we have to make this move, I'm going to make sure that we're going to take all of those things that are familiar to you and make sure you feel like you're in a home-like setting. Like, there are ways that you can sort of communicate things to make sure that you summarize what they've heard and then sort of do some steps going forward. Be prepared to agree to disagree. If that's your communication pattern with your family, and it always has been, it is not likely to change as somebody gets older. Typically, whatever communication pattern has been there is going to continue. And so there may be times that you just have to say, you know what, we're not going to agree on this, but let's just move on for now. And then always end with a positive, right? Try not to end a visit on a bad note or a phone conversation. You know, switch gears to the grandkids or switch gears to something that was a positive memory or something positive coming up. There can be a lot of challenges in trying to have these conversations, but you don't want to jeopardize your relationship. So always trying to end whatever that conversation is with a positive seems like a little thing, but it's important.
I'm curious, Amy, I know cases where the parent needs help and the child is actively trying to help,
Yes.
but it's that age-old cliche where you can lead a horse to water, you can't make them drink, and
Yep.
and
And
I
they
know that
resist. Yeah.
they resist, but I'm curious, what would you tell the child in terms
Yeah.
of,
So
I mean,
that's where giving them things in writing, the older adult, or resources. Mom, I know you don't think you need help with this, but I'm going to leave this information for you, because it puts it back in their court to be able to take action without saying you were right or I did what you wanted me to do. It allowed them to be a little more independent in the choice. So again, keep offering those resources even though they haven't taken it yet. And in the worst case scenario, I always advise that families be ready to act in the crisis. If Mom or Dad is completely refusing, right, to plan ahead to get the help they need, you really see them not taking meds correctly, not eating correctly, something will eventually happen that is hopefully a small crisis, sometimes a big crisis. But you kind of have to know as a family, like, okay, what are we going to do when that happens? If Mom ends up in the hospital, it's a chance to say, all right, we tried it your way. If you want to go back home, these are the things we have to agree to. Like, you have a little more bargaining power then. But sometimes it does take that first fall or something happening that, you know, the older person really realizes, okay, I did need more help. But again, the more you can kind of make it their idea, which takes a little bit of creative communication sometimes, the better. But if they just keep resisting, be prepared to act when things fall apart.
that's hard.
It is very hard. It's hard to watch someone you love failing when you know their quality of life could be better. And sometimes families will bring in us as like a neutral third party, right? You might have told your mom or dad 100 times that, you know, Mom's taking care of Dad, it's impacting Mom's health, she won't get more people in the house, you know, Dad needs more care, whatever's going on. They may not listen to you, but there may be a doctor they trust. There may be a professional that they trust. It could be an attorney, it could be a financial advisor, it could be a care manager. If there's sometimes it's better coming from a third party, right, than it is from your adult child. So enlist those people. I always call it kind of building your support network. And so there may be people in that network that your parents really respect that could maybe have a better impact or get them to comply when you can't. All right, so we're going to run through some of the things that you can look for that would be red flags that your parent would need more support. Bills not being paid on time, just like this lady I met with this week. She has plenty of money, but they're shutting her electrical bill off because she hadn't paid it in 3 months. I have other people who pay their bills 3 times because they're so paranoid about missing one. And so when I see a letter from the water, company saying, you've already paid this bill and it's on auto draft. They didn't realize it was on auto draft, so they repaid it. Those can be some indicators. Talked about mail piling up. If you know that mom or dad's experiencing a change in memory, that's going to have an impact on their ability to do some of these day-to-day things. If you notice missed or canceled medical appointments, that's a red flag. They're typically canceling because there's something going on they don't want anybody to know about, or they just keep forgetting the appointment. Anytime there's a new medical issue, a recent hospitalization, it's a good time to revisit some conversations about how they're doing, how they're getting needs met. If it's a parent caring for another parent, that's the one we see in the hospital, right? It's a spouse who's caring for the other spouse that no one's paying attention to, that usually ends up with a medical crisis. And so if it's a situation where your parents are caring for each other, really watch for burnout and for that person who's serving as a caregiver. Same if you have a sibling that's helping mom or dad and maybe they're local and you're far, really watch again for signs of caregiver burnout. Furniture walking is one of my favorites. Mom or dad get around the house fine, but then I go and their hands on the dining room chair, their hands on the couch, and they're furniture walking their way through the house to sort of stabilize themselves, but they don't need a cane, they don't need a walker, don't need grab bars. That to me is a fall waiting to happen. They're shuffling or tripping on throw rugs. But that when you see someone start to do that kind of furniture walking, their balance and mobility is off, and that's the time to address it, whether it's physical therapist to assess them or exercise program. But it's a red flag. Any unexplained bruises, pay attention. I had, clients all the time. They're like, well, I showed up at mom's and her arm's black or there's black eye, but she can't remember what happened. Something happened. And so being in tune to those and not letting them just play it off. Personal hygiene is a big one. If you notice your parent is wearing the same thing every time you see them, there's a reason. There's probably some cognitive issues there that they don't realize they're putting on the same thing over and over again. Or if you notice an odor, even if they told you they just showered this morning, don't use common sense. You can tell if somebody's checked the shampoo levels, check the bar of soap. Those are the things I look at all the time. It's been the same bottle of shampoo for 6 months, probably not actually getting used. And so pay attention to those cues. A lot of out of character behavior. If your parent usually is saying things that they would never typically say, there's probably something going on mentally. And it could be just from a med change or nutrition, something that they're deficit in. It could be a urinary tract infection. It doesn't necessarily mean they have Alzheimer's. There could be other things that you could address when you see cognitive or behavioral changes. So again, don't ignore them. A change in normal routine. Your parents have always done things the same way, and then you suddenly notice that there's a change in that routine. There's probably, again, a reason. Maybe they're incontinent and they're embarrassed. Maybe they're forgetting to do things. Maybe they can't keep scoring the golf course like they used to. There's typically a reason if you see somebody sort of changing those patterns. Too many groceries are not enough. People tend to go one way or the other. There may be 50 cans of the same thing because every time they go to the store, they buy that, not remembering. I've seen some cabinets that would do a hoarder proud. I mean, there's enough stockpile in there for years. Or the opposite, the person has nothing and there's the same TV dinner they bought that's sitting in there for weeks. So open the refrigerator. You can say you're thirsty and want a drink, but when you open that refrigerator, really pay attention. What are the dates on things? How long have they been there? Weight loss or gain, both can be indicators there's an issue. Changes in the housekeeping. If you certainly notice that, things are unkempt, there's clutter, things that aren't typical. And some of those, it's just as easy as getting somebody in to help because their mobility's changed, their eyesight's changed. The house isn't being kept up. Any symptoms of depression or isolation, older adult is not likely to identify it as depression. That wasn't really a term when they were growing up. They may say they feel heavy or sad or use different terminology, but I always, there's this dynamic we see, I call it battening down the hatches. If suddenly you notice that they're living in really 1 to 2 rooms of the house, they're really only going out maybe once or twice a week, they're shrinking their world to what they can control. That's usually an indicator that there's something going on cognitively, medically, or that they're depressed. So those are important to pay attention to. Changes in sleep, sleeping too much, sleeping not enough. Obviously, driving is a whole nother webinar. It's a big issue with older adults because it's their independence. But if there's accidents, don't ignore them. If you would not put your kids in the back seat of their car, it's probably time to address the driving. We talked about repetitive clothing, medications. Pay attention to the bottle. The bottle prescription date was written on a certain day, and it was a 60-day prescription, and there's still 50 pills in the bottle, and it's 30 days later, then they're probably not taking them correctly. If there's this magic cabinet that you open with tons of expired medications, that's a problem. Taking medications incorrectly is a very, very common thing that we see. I'm a big advocate of pill boxes, even for myself, because then I can say, oh, look, I missed Wednesday. So again, something easier to implement before there's an issue. But if you notice, pay attention to those dates and those prescription meds. And the pharmacist can give you a printout of when stuff was filled, how often, and you can track back and see if they're taking things correctly. Obviously, if they've made a move to a different state, this is more important, but all the time, people not paying taxes for years. Legal documents way out of date, their estate planning stuff hasn't been done. So those are all just sort of important things, and it's just sort of a look and see approach. Like when you're in their surroundings, it's really easy to want to think everything's fine and not pay attention to those little things, but really start to look for those little things. Like I said, look in the refrigerator, open the cabinet, look for the stacks of mail, you know, even the inspection sticker on the car, the tag sticker, you know, are they out of date? Those things are all really going to be good indicators to you of when it's time to have some of these conversations or to get more help in the home.
Yeah.
All right, and then all of that goes to thinking about yourself, right? You see your parents, you see family members, so it's really starting to think about, have you planned for your own senior years? So this is the little graph that we use. I use this when I'm assessing older adults, but I love it for adult children because these are the different areas that we see people needing help and really look at. And so, you know, health and disability, they're medical things, crisis intervention if the person really is in crisis, our legal things in order, meaning their estate planning documents. Have you thought about local resources? Is there somebody being an advocate for you, right? If you maybe have a child who's out of the area or don't have adult children, who's going to be your advocate as you get older? We have a lot of older adults who are very, very healthy, independent, but they have no local support network. And so a lot of times we're just on call for them. I may only see them 4 times a year to check in and build a relationship, and that may go on for years. But they've thought about who's going to be my support network if I end up in the hospital, who's going to be my advocate. Looking at those financial dynamics, thinking about housing, would I remain in this house? Is it conducive to aging? Would I want to live in some retirement community? Have I ever been in one before? What would it look like? And the same with financial planning as you deal with all the time. Have I saved, you know, if my goal is to age in this way in this environment, have I set myself up financially to be able to do that? Or what do I need to do while I still have time to set myself up financially to really be able to age the way I want to?
Yeah. Well, Amy, this has been very helpful. I know I've got a ton of questions. I'm sure we'll open it up for questions in just a second. And by that, before I forget, on the I think the dashboard, there should be an orange button on the dashboard. If you're wanting to ask a question, click that button, and then there's a question tab. You can just type a question in there, and I will ask Amy the questions. I guess one thing that came to mind as we're going through this, we were talking about the number one cause of elder abuse is actually family, right? And so I guess I'm curious from your standpoint, how would you advise, say, sibling A to get involved in helping mom or dad cut off sibling B?
Right.
Ever had that happen?
All the time. And it's tricky because sometimes mom has given legal authority to the person who's actually exploiting them. And in extreme cases like that, it really ends up, and we have, gosh, I have probably 6 clients like this right now, that the other siblings have to go through an attorney to court and get guardianship assigned of that parent. I have several that it's taken that because the mom or dad gave legal authority, like power of attorney, to the sibling who's exploiting them, spending all of their money, whatnot. And so in those cases, you really sometimes have to go through the legal system and have a guardian assigned. And of course, that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is you can approach that sibling away from mom or dad to kind of say, look, we know what you're doing. You know, mom needs this money to take care of herself for the next 20 years and to make sure they don't have access to those accounts. So that's where watching those bank accounts, watching if there's big amounts of cash being taken out. It's hard because they're family relationships, and it may be that mom's helped that one child her whole life because they just didn't quite make it in life, and there's some guilt there. And so addressing that sibling, but sometimes you do have to take legal action to really protect the assets and accounts so that there is something left to take care of your parent.
Yeah, the couple times I've seen that, the intervention doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's why it ends up legal, which is messy. Obviously, having a court-appointed guardian is not ideal, but there have been situations where the families were so toxic, or maybe some of the adult children were very well intended, but they just couldn't get anywhere with the other that was taking advantage of the parent or living in their basement and is never going to leave. So there are times when having to go through the legal channels is the only way to really address or stop what's going on.
So talk to us, Amy. One of the questions that has come in is, what are some of the typical services that you and AOS provides? And then I'd like to, obviously, for those clients and prospective clients, whoever is watching this is going to be open for everybody on the on our social media channels. How would somebody find somebody like you in some other part of the country? Because one thing that I clued in on or keyed in on is you made this comment that you're the point of contact for family members who have seniors in the Moore County area, but they live somewhere else.
Right.
So talk to us a little bit about some of the services that you guys provide, and then how others can find similar types of agencies.
Yep, there's 2 things I'll touch on there that are sort of important to know. And like with our business, there's 2 sides. So the care management, which used to be called geriatric care management, and people didn't like that word, and they called it aging care, aging life care, something. But we have professional trade associations. So if you go to aginglifecare.org, there's actually nationwide databases of people who have the degree credentials and the certifications to provide care management. And so you can find a professional, and I'll go through some of the things we do, but you can find a professional any of the 50 states and beyond that is an aging life care manager who's been certified, who's been credentialed. And so the scope of things that we do really varies. So we may come in and do a full needs assessment where we're looking at all those core areas that we're kind of in that wheel and looking at, okay, what's going on now? What do we want to happen in the future? And giving the family a blueprint or a guide or resources in all of these areas of kind of what to do, kind of a plan of care. We do weekly things, from whether it's making sure the meds are set up correctly, doctor's appointments that we attend and can ask questions and be eyes and ears and email back to adult children with permission of the parent, of course. You know, there's times that we're really that person who's there in the crisis. So I may be the one at the hospital with your parent and communicating back to you, do you need to come, or what needs to happen? And so it's really that advocate. You know, we're really kind of, you know, I guess hired advocates that have a degree or an education in aging and are trained to sort of know how to navigate the different things. And we know the local resources. So if there's, you know, if it's transportation, meals, caregiving, a new doctor, whatever it is that that parent needs, we're really tapped into the community to be able to help you find it really quickly instead of spending hours and hours and hours researching on the internet. And so, like I said, there's a national association, and I'm pretty sure it's aginglifecare.org. I'll send you the link, but that you can put in your zip code and it literally will pull up all the professionals in your area and show you their credentials and their area of expertise. So that is super helpful. And I'm always happy to help people navigate that. If I have somebody who emails me or calls me and says, hey, my parents in Indiana, I can say, oh, I know somebody there who's really good. Let me help connect you. The other side of what we do and what several older adults end up needing is that home care piece, right? And so this is, again, an area, there's a nationwide shortage of caregivers right now. This was already expected to happen because of the flip in that more older adults and less younger. But then you throw COVID on top of it, and you throw some of the other dynamics that have happened in the labor force. And so people are waiting 3-4 weeks, sometimes longer now, trying to find the care they need in the home. And so what happens is they're just finding anybody off the street, housekeepers, brothers, sisters, whatever, because they need care. So I would say that it's also very important to be aware of, if you're looking for care for your parent, make sure it's an agency or company that's credentialed, whether they're on the private duty side or the home care side. You always want to make sure there's been a background check, that there's been some basic checks done with these caregivers, because that's where a lot of the financial abuse can happen as well. And so you just want to be really knowledgeable about who's coming into the home, who you're hiring. And so there are some different kind of trade associations for that too, but it's also just important to realize, if you feel like your parent's going to need care, start looking ahead of time, because it takes a little bit to credential. And with the shortage that we're seeing now, we used to be able to do a 24-hour turnaround easily for any request, and now it may take a week. We've had clients calling us saying they've been waiting, again, 3-4 weeks through other companies to try to get care in place. So just be aware, it's a little bit more difficult now, but you still want to make sure that you know who's coming into that home.
So that brings me to the next question that came in. You mentioned, you talked a little bit about loneliness. It's one of the reasons why adults answer the telemarketer calls, is because they're lonely. So what's your experience with paid companions for social purposes as opposed to an actual caregiver? Does that work? Is it just
It
another
works. And
opportunity for
so,
scams, or what?
no, as long as, again, in the private duty world, it's more a caregiver's a caregiver. So we have a lot of clients who the caregiver is literally going out shopping with them. Maybe they do gardening. Maybe they go to a movie. They go to a hairdresser. Isolation is a very real issue that can lead to a lot of other medical and mental problems. And so if your parent is isolated, you need some type of interaction. So if they're not going to find it on their own, it is important. And it can be a companion, but that companion still needs to be credentialed somehow. You need to, whether it's personal references of other people that have used them, even if it's a volunteer, or whether you're paying a caregiver to come in. And it's not necessarily geared at like a certified nursing assistant. This is just a private duty companion who's going to come in and do meal prep with them, but they're getting that social interaction. It's very important. It's important to mental stimulation. We know that people eat better when they're not alone, when they have a companion to eat a meal with. And so if you're not able to get your parent to engage in these social groups on their own, then sometimes having that paid caregiver to come in is important. And there's a lot of people in their 50s and 60s who've gone back to work as caregivers. So it seems like a friend to them, right? If there's somebody coming in that's a little bit older, they're wearing street clothes, but it's a private duty caregiver that's really coming in to sort of be their friend, sometimes your parent's willing to accept that. And again, they build a routine. They go to the farmer's market, they go to get their hair done. And it really can help stabilize the situation. Plus then that person can start to see if there's some red flags in the home that may indicate more help is needed.
Follow-up question to that. Once a client starts working with you, do you have a process to move from one service level to another? Can you help with everything from helping around the house once in a while to full-time care?
Yes, and so again, a lot of our clients come to us independently, and maybe we're just sort of on call for crisis management stuff, and then suddenly they need a little more help with meal prep, and then that fall happens, and suddenly they need 24-hour care in the home. So those are the type of things where we just transition with them, and that's where on the care management side, that's the person who's navigating those resources. On the caregiver side, it may mean switching out a caregiver with a different skill level, or adding a team of caregivers where the person's only had one. That happens fairly routinely, as we're really trying to transition and grow from that independent all the way to end of life. So like we work with hospice a lot. If we have a client that's sort of We work with a lot of professionals, but as that person's needs increase, then there are other resources we may pull in to make sure that their needs are being met from kind of A to Z.
Yeah. So part of that too is from a long-term care standpoint. Is some of this covered by the typical long-term care policy, or is it kind of hit and
That's an
miss?
excellent question. So I review a lot of long-term care policies, and some of the older ones are what I call traditional nursing home policies, where once you look at the policy that mom or dad has paid into for years, all it covers is a nursing home for 100 days or something that's really not going to help them. So the way our system is set up, really Medicare is what's based on age, and it's really meant for acute medical things. It's not meant for someone who needs ongoing, long-term, or maybe the person has dementia support in the home. That is almost always an out-of-pocket expense. So then you run into long-term care policies, which really act like private pay, whether you're in a facility or at home. And so every policy, as you know, is very, very different. And so reading the explanation of benefits in that policy before you need it is really important, because is there a benefit for home care? Does that benefit require you to use a licensed home care agency, or can you use private duty independent caregivers, which is where most of the home care is provided? Does it have a benefit for adult daycare? Is there a benefit for assisted living? Newer ones have benefit for care advisors, which covers some of our services. And so they're just really individual, but it's important to look at that now, have somebody who deals with them look at that explanation of benefits, to be able to see, okay, when I need this policy, realistically, what is it going to pay out per day, and then what does care cost? The other thing that we saw, facility care has been going up in cost a lot, but the other thing we saw in the last 2 years, because again, we had the market dynamic shift of how many people needed care versus how many people can provide it. And so the rates for hiring somebody to come privately into your home skyrocketed from maybe $18 an hour to $25, and in some areas, Charlotte, Raleigh, bigger areas, bigger cities, people are paying $30 and up to have somebody coming into their home. And so I don't see that shift changing based on the population dynamics. It really shifted the home care market a lot. And so even if you have a long-term care policy, you need to know exactly what dollar amount per day that's going to cover and what criteria has to be met. So, and that's a whole nother webinar we could do on just understanding long-term care benefits, but it's really important to pull that policy out now, so you'll know, or even if you thought mom or dad had one, but you haven't seen an updated schedule of benefits in years, now's the time to get that out and let somebody like myself, or there's other professionals that can look at that and kind of know how that's really going to help you.
Yeah, amen. Well, it's 8 or 9 after, so I think we probably should land the plane. Amy, this has been very, very helpful, very insightful. As I said earlier, we recorded this, and so we'll run it through the compliance firm and verify neither one of us went off the rails. And if so, we'll post it so people can reference this. They can forward it to folks who might find it valuable. If I can summarize what you've said, to me, what I'm hearing you say is that there is help for parents, and I think our task as either advisors or as that next generation is to do a little legwork before we need the help.
Definitely.
Especially if you've got a parent that is in another part of the area, even if it's in the same state, but it's not, they're not really close.
If they're more than an hour away from you, you need to have a plan, because you're not going to be able to drop everything and be there.
And it sounds like we need to go to aginglifecare.org and start looking for who is going to be the resource, and begin making those phone calls to the local Amy's of the world to say, what do you do? Can I count on you? And start doing that research and lay that foundation now, so that when you get to that stage, you don't know, you know who you're going to call.
Definitely. Yep. Plan your resources now, and it will make your life much easier.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Amy, again, I thank you for spending some time with us. Again, our contact information is on the screen. I should have put yours on there. I will make sure that it is included. If you have any follow-up questions, folks, reach out to me, and I can always connect you with Amy
Feel free to email me questions or give me a call.
Yep. Thank you so much, Amy. And again, everybody, thanks for joining us, and we hope you found it helpful.
Thank you.